Hi, everybody. I'm Rachel Donadio, the curator of cultural programs here at the American Library in Paris, and I'm very happy to welcome you tonight for a conversation between Cody Delistraty and Lindsey Tramuta about Cody's book on grief. As you know, the American Library in Paris is the largest English language lending library on the continent, and we've been in operation for more than 100 years. We have the pleasure of hosting many writers, artists, journalists, and academics, and we are happy to continue this legacy tonight. The two speakers will talk for about 45 minutes. After that, we will open up to audience questions, first from those of you here in the room, and then if we have time, to those of you joining online on Zoom. Cody Delistraty is a writer and speechwriter, most recently working as the culture editor at the Wall Street Journal magazine. He has written for the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and was the European arts columnist for the Paris Review. He has degrees in politics from New York University and in history from the University of Oxford. British Vogue named him a Best Young Writer of the Year, and he has frequently given talks about art, creativity, and loss. He lives in New York City. Lindsey Tramuta has been based in Paris since 2006. She is a bilingual French-English culture and travel journalist, best-selling author, podcaster, and editorial consultant. Since 2012, her work has appeared in T, the New York Times Style magazine, the New York Times, Condé Nast Traveler, Fortune magazine, Afar magazine, Travel and Leisure, Eater, Bloomberg, Elle, and Vogue, among other international publications. Please help me welcome them with a big round of applause.
Cody.
Hey, Lindsey. Good list of publications. Legit.
First of all, everyone is going to get to discover this book, but I want to say that as a reader and also as your friend, and that is not a spoiler, we have known each other a long time, which is why I'm here with him. This is a very special book, and part of that is because it touches on the universality of the theme of grief and loss, and that makes it very pertinent. But it's also the way you address it. You address the culture around loss, grieving, and the history of grieving, and also how humans have tried to find solutions to this very enduring feeling. You yourself bring yourself into this story, which is where it begins, and you have experienced a personal loss, and years after the loss of your mother, you talk about feeling this kind of acute and unresolved form of grief that was not always visible to everyone else, and I count myself among those who never fully realized what you were experiencing, and the repression that you felt was the way for you to go through life, and so I felt like I was getting to know you even more through reading this book. But to start, I think it would be helpful for people to have an idea of whether there was a catalyzing moment that prompted you to start really investigating the theme of grief, and then how did you go about structuring the book so that you're telling not only your story, but highlighting the evolutions of grief research?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks, everyone, for coming here. I know there's lots of other stuff you can do on a Tuesday than come to the 7e, so I really appreciate it, and thank you for coming out. It means a lot. Yeah, I mean, it came out of a lot of... my initial reaction... So my mom died a decade ago of metastatic melanoma, and my initial reaction was, how do I be a good griever? And in the US, I had always been a pretty good student. I'd been a pretty okay athlete. I'd tried to sort of, that was my way of honoring my mother in a way. And I had this sense of, okay, so what does it mean to grieve well? And in an American context, often in a British context, maybe to some degree in a French context, but especially in the US context, that meant really pushing onward. That meant subscribing to this kind of, now as I understand, false idea of the 5 stages of grief, this idea that there's such a thing as closure, which is sort of mythical, chimeric concept. And I really wanted to have other people give me the praise of, you're doing so well, and that always means, or tends to mean in the US, you're not making a big deal about it, you're not making a fuss, you're moving on. And so with that sort of in mind, the book is really split into 2 sections. The first being a search for kind of individualized cures for grief, which came out of partly sort of my own desire, but then partly a desire to really look into what does the future look like for this. There are these new technologies. There is this new medicine. In 2019, the World Health Organization called prolonged grief disorder. They added it to the ICD, which is the International Classification of Disorders, and in 2022, the DSM-5 text revision added it in the US. So you really had this idea that maybe there is a form of grief that can be solved. And then the second half of the book is sort of saying, wait, let's zoom out. Let's look to history. Let's look to community. Let's look to being present with others. Let's look to understanding a wider version of grief than we typically do. And so the book is really sort of this journey from the individual into something larger, more historical, and more communal.
And obviously, you're not the first person to cover grief. It's kind of a
true.
robust canon. But in your book, you cite various scholars. You look to people who have written about this in the past. And you talk about the life-shortening effects of bereavement and pathological grief and manifestations of grief, which vary. In your case, it was more of a repression and going through life feeling like, maybe something bad was going to happen to you. That's a theme, right? Where you imagine that, maybe I'm going to take a false step and I'm going to injure myself and that's it. And what that looked like to you in the years following her death. What did you find valuable in what was written or researched before? And what did you simply find unhelpful, both for your individual struggle and for researching what could or writing about what could come next?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I really found looking at a larger picture of the history of how grief has been dealt with in the West to be very interesting, and seeing that this place we're at now of general quietude, general repression isn't at all where we always were. I mean, in the 18th century, Philippe Ariz, the French medievalist, was talking about how the sort of ease of death of regular people, where there was a sense of you're almost always dying in your own bed, in your bedroom, you had your family around you, you had some kind of religious ritual or rites being done. There was really a sense of that there was a normalizing sense of death. And it's about, the most recent statistic, I think, is about 80% of people in the U.S. die in hospitals. Only 20% die in their own home, and it was almost inverted essentially at that time. And then you really move through though into the early 20th century, which is what I really identify as a turning point, where you have Freud coming up with kind of new definitions of grief, of loss, something that can be worked through in the therapist's office. You have World War II, so Woodrow Wilson wanting to convert the grief and the death of American soldiers who were entering World War II into a sense of patriotism, because there wasn't a lot of, he ran on a sort of semi-isolationist platform. There wasn't a lot of excitement from his constituents about sending their spouses, sending their fathers, sending their brothers to go likely die in a war that a lot of Americans didn't think had anything to do with them. And I found this really interesting archive where he basically was writing letters to one of the key suffragettes at the time, and telling her, hey, instead of having, because that was still at a time in the U.S. early 20th century when women would wear full black mourning. They were marching, they were in protests, they were saying, we want this death to be seen. And he basically made a trade where he said, I'll support the 19th Amendment, which is women's right to vote, if you ask your suffragettes to, instead of wearing full black mourning, just wearing a gold band, a gold star on a white band. And that struck me as very interesting, of there's this physical change in what you see in the visual landscape of grief. And then all the way up till today, I could go on for this forever. I don't want to be too long of an answer, but now you have this repression, but I see in the future a slight change, and we can talk about this later a bit, but toward a hopeful hybridization of wanting to be a little bit more public. So that's on social media, that's, oh my gosh, this was a crazy one, but in 2013 there was a big push toward funeral selfies, which was a little scary. But the most generous part of myself too says these are people that want to share death with others. They want to share their loss, and maybe like it's so hard to push through right now to be really open about grief, and people are doing it in awkward and weird and bizarre ways, but at least there's an attempt in the most generous, charitable way.
But among the research that you uncovered, and maybe there are things you did not include in the book, what did you find just completely unhelpful for your own struggle with grief?
I mean, so many then individualist solutions. So I talked to, the book sort of opens with this new science about memory deletion, which has been done in rats in 2013 at MIT, where they're able to choose a specific memory and using something called optogenetics, delete or create this memory. And I talked to an ethicist of neuroscience. I talked to a few people. A lot of people were like, this is going to be a long time for humans. This is way more complex, obviously, than a human brain, than a tiny rat brain. But saying, yeah, it's possible at some point. And so having this sort of eternal sunshine thought process and reflecting on that and thinking, is that something we would want to do if we did have that capability? And then things like artificial intelligence, where I recreated my mom as a chatbot, but now, of course, you can do all sorts of woolly and wild things of they can fully talk to you with their voice. I was talking to a friend at dinner a few nights ago who said you can create podcasts out of Google Docs where it sounds like two fluid people speaking to one another. And so you really have this sense of, I was trying to get in kind of on this ground floor of the future of individual solutions, none of which I found that compelling, frankly, but wanting to reflect on them and kind of look at them now before it's too late to some degree.
Well, I actually think that's, you're referencing the technology chapter, basically, but with mentioning the chatbot. And I found that one to be super fascinating because you start by saying that actually technology in some form, whether it was like the electric telegraph or later video games, have been used to sort of bridge the worlds between the living and the dead. Why have we? Is it simply because we're not allowed, or we're discouraged from showing our grief publicly, that people have resorted to these methods, or is there something else? Is it just because it exists and therefore people will try to seek comfort wherever they can find it?
Yeah, I think it's the latter to some extent. I also think there is the value you put in is the value that you get to some extent too. So if for me, I use this app called Replica, which is sort of the main app of creating a person, and you can train them to have similar character traits and speaking styles and such. And I also use something called Project December, which was a little more complicated. But I think that for me, it gave me a sense of if it gave me the time to really reflect and think, what are the things I would want to ask my mother? What are the questions? What are the things we missed? What are the things I was hoping for? Then to some degree, there is value there, but you could also do that on your own with a journal, right? So, the value is tricky. It's a little input-output, though.
I was surprised, though, you did mention that if people sometimes are more forthcoming with robots.
That's true.
Right?
Yeah, there's been a lot of research on that. Yeah.
Even in the medical field broadly, not just dealing with grief. And I found that quite interesting. I guess it just takes away the idea of judgment, perhaps.
Yeah, it is a super interesting phenomenon where in the U.S., a lot of military veterans who are coming back, they're checked for PTSD in early stages by basically chatbots. One is called Ellie that DARPA has. There's other examples. I talked to a lot of therapists who were saying that you're more likely to say something off the cuff to a robot or to a non-human entity than to another human. You might really, yell about your boss when you're in the shower, but you might not do it to a friend. And so maybe that's something with judgment. I'm not totally sure, and I'm not sure if the research is there, but there's definitely pockets where these things can be valuable. I think what's scary and what frightens me personally is this idea that, we can recreate a person or we can cure grief. And obviously the title is something of a misnomer because it's a journey toward a cure that ultimately finds that kind of the cure is the friends we make along the way a little bit. But I think tech is it remains to be seen. Well, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Is that the most controversial of all the tools that are out there now? I mean, there's a part that you go into psilocybin, so magic mushrooms and other forms of maybe experimental drugs. What is the state of that in terms of both grief research and the efficacy toward?
Yeah, I mean, psilocybin
grief
is really cool, and it's gotten a lot more legitimate scholarly research and research money, and in Northern California especially, there's a guy called Robin Carhart Harris, who's really one of the main guys studying this. And for grief specifically, I spoke to him and he told me his most compelling one was this young man who had gone through all sorts of griefs, where his mother had died, he'd just gone through a bad breakup, and he'd gotten in a car accident. And Robin Carhart Harris was like, hey, do you want to come to my lab and we can do some psilocybin together, basically. And the guy did, and he found that he was able to sort of reframe and reposition his thought about his mom, where he thought that thinking about her was kind of like zapping energy. He started to see her as a physical ulcer on him and started to rethink that as maybe there's a degree to which you can let go while still keeping her in your life. And so just these new ideas of perception and reframing are genuinely promising in psilocybin. So I think that's up there. I did a kooky thing called bibliotherapy that was fun.
I liked that part as well. But I want to ask, you did an attempt with psilocybin, right?
That's such a funny... I did psilocybin, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, not an attempt.
No,
You did use it.
You're my attorney here. You're like, you might have attempted it fictionally.
Did you do that in a sort of controlled way, or were you alone?
The latter. And I kind of messed up. I feel like I was talking to my brother about it after, and he was like, I don't know if you got like your dosage right. I don't know if you sort of did this correctly. And so something that in the book is very much about the research and about other people, and it's a little bit of me weaved in, but a little bit maybe less than something like looking at art or bibliotherapy or the AI, for instance.
No, for sure. I find it interesting because there are services that exist in you can do this in a very guided way and make sure you don't hurt yourself and everything is tailored.
I was too gung ho for it. I was just gotta do it. So yeah, no, it is true though.
So this book is out in the world. It's been since June.
End of June.
End of June. You finished writing it quite a while ago, but now that you've been going on tour, you've been meeting people. How has the experience, or how has your relationship to your own grief changed? Do you think that this is sort of like a closing chapter now? Is it that simple?
Yeah, I mean, I think just talking about it and being a person, as many of us are, who writes about it, thinks about it. I've been shocked in a good way, but of how many people are really desperate to talk about their grief. I had to travel a lot for the research in this book, and I remember I was in San Francisco and I was seeing a researcher during the day, and at night I just went to a bar and I was reading a book and ended up talking with someone next to me, and she told me, I talked to her about the book, and she goes, yeah, like, I haven't told anyone this, but just a few days ago, my husband died. Like, I don't think anyone can understand. I had someone in Mexico City who was telling me that their brother had just died. As soon as I brought it up, like, people are so much more desiring to talk about these things. And I think we often think, and we get stuck in this kind of vicious cycle where you as the griever don't want to burden another by bringing it up, and then the person who is theoretically there for them, even if they're acting in good faith, doesn't want to like make it awkward, doesn't want to hurt the person in some way by asking about it. And so just this simple act of talking about it, saying that it's something that you've experienced, that you've dealt with, which I think in one definition or another, every single person has experienced, will experience, is experiencing. And so that was really moving for me, and that's something that I'll definitely have with me, like far beyond the shelf life of this book or my even.
And was it difficult for you to, take off the reporter hat exclusively and put yourself into it, because most of your writing has not been first person, and you're revealing a lot of the complicated emotions that you went through. And you talk about your father, you talk a little bit about your brother, but it's far more personal, even if you do have the sort of research backbone that helps you, make it a broader
Yeah,
look.
I mean, it was important to me to be well researched, to be well reported, to really try to shine a light on this future and try to analyze what it's going to look like. But it was also really important to me to give the human aspect of it and give the reader a way in. And that way in was through me, and it was my life. And these were the things that I was looking at and trying. And so it seemed honestly just very natural to have this combination of memoir and reporting that it ended up having.
Of all the methods you looked at for handling grief, and you looked at tech, we talked about that. You also did laughter therapy. You talked about the memory deletion, the mushrooms. What is the most powerful salve for you? And especially, not just for you, but what do you think has the most potential to alleviate some of the pain for the most prolonged forms of grief?
I think two things, neither of which are the sexy things in the book, neither of which are the like, oh, cool tech, but instead the really Pauline Boss talks about ambiguous loss, and Kenneth Doka talks about disenfranchised grief, and really this idea of expanding the notion of loss beyond just you lost your mom, beyond just your brother died, and into things like financial ruin, divorce, having, to some extent, I was sort of pushing it, but I wrote an op-ed a few weeks ago about even the feelings that come at the end of summer as being a form of loss, and really leaning into that and thinking through these things as legitimate forms of grief that deserve reflection, that merit reflection. And so, yeah, I found that to be very valuable. And then I also found community and just going home and being present and being with other people and not getting caught up. And that's sort of one of the central arguments of this book, is that it's so easy to get caught up in this solution culture, in this individualistic culture of you just make a chatbot, you just give yourself a medical diagnosis. I mean, that's so popular now, especially in the US, of everything is a diagnosis, everything has a label, and that's valuable to some degree, but it can also be stifling if it really puts you in sort of a lockstep line by yourself. You're just within the medical community rather than talking to other people, breaking that vicious cycle we were talking about of discussion. So yeah, community.
But do you mean community particularly with people who are also going through it? Because
it's a good question.
Because it takes not only the griever to confront their feelings with people who may not be equipped to understand yet, or show up in the way that you need, but also for those people, your friends and people who are sort of on the outside of the immediate experience of grief, to be prepared for what that means, to be there for you. So, is the immediate solution trying to connect with other people who can at least relate in the short term to that particular visceral experience?
Yeah, I found this thing called the dinner party that's very cool, that gets together people, I think it's youngish people, I think you have to be under 45 maybe, but who've had similar forms of loss, and they get together and they just have dinner together and they talk about death, they don't talk about their death, but having that support. But then also I think someone who hasn't experienced the same grief, it's silly to think that they couldn't still be there for you. You don't have to, I'm not saying that's what you're saying, but I think that we would all do well to understand that you don't have to fully understand to be able to empathize. And I think that is something that people, I don't want to get into it, I don't understand, I don't want to make it worse. It's such an easy thing to say, and it's more often than not a bit more of a cop-out than I think people are giving themselves credit for. And so, yeah, I found, that's all I'll say on that. Yeah.
It's been posited that as a society, coming out of a pandemic, we are all working through some form of grief, like a collective grief, whether we realize it or not. Some people, I think we can argue, everyone in this room knows someone who is very much not okay after the last 4 years. Do you think, you mentioned other forms of loss, financial loss, divorce, do you think that what we're experiencing or have experienced together globally merits the kind of methods that you're describing, and maybe just the fact that we talk about how crazy the last 4 years have been, or whatever, is a way of sort of performing therapy with one another.
Well, and we really haven't too, right? Like, I think
not in a formal way.
Yeah,
no.
and I think that's a top-down choice. There's a choice to not grieve these things together. There's a choice to not legitimize that loss. I mean, I'm trying to think. There was that huge New York Times cover that had when we hit 100,000 dead or something, and it was dots representing people who died by COVID. But other than that, I mean, maybe I missed something, but it didn't seem like in the US at least there was any sort of governmental, let's have a day, let's have a moment, let's really reflect on this. Because what that would do is it would create something of havoc for them, because then something would actually have to be done. And right now, obviously in the US, there's a sense that COVID is over. I mean, you see this here as well.
Not only
you
there.
see. I mean, I'm not wearing a mask, but I think there's really a decision on what's worth grieving. That decision is made by people in higher levels of power than I think we often give credit for.
And it's also about people in power at corporations. And so I think that leads into something you wanted to read for everybody.
Yeah, I have a little excerpt, not too long, don't worry, but about sort of how we narrativize loss and the sort of like TikTokification of loss to some degree. I'll just go ahead. The 18th century philosopher Edmund Burke proposed that pain from a distance can bring pleasure. Fear, so long as we sense we're safe while experiencing it, can delight, he said. Aristotle suggested that through witnessing tragedy, we achieve relief from our burdens, catharsis. By consuming tragedy through TV, movies, music, art, and books, or even by seeing it ourselves, so long as it's brief and we have a ready escape, as we're driving past, say, or getting off the subway, we get to feel we're experiencing and learning from a universal phenomenon when really we are only consuming a curated or circumscribed version. This, quote, curated grief can be used to bolster one's own profile, particularly in the age of self-branding and social media. You might, for instance, post a TikTok lamenting the horrors of a faraway tragedy and how you, personally, are struggling with it, driving engagement. Or you might jump in on a hashtag or change your social media profiles to align yourself with a loss that has little to do with you. Most generously, this is an attempt at building community, at forging bonds with others grieving. Cynically, it is self-serving, helping you to establish your supposed moral goodness or make a claim on your tastes. Your outpouring of words on social media about the death of David Bowie, for example, would probably be more about demonstrating to your connections you have excellent taste in music and are an empathetic person than it would be about, say, consoling his surviving family. Crystal Abedin, an ethnographer of internet culture, calls this publicity grieving, in which one nods toward a community in grief for personal gain. Publicity grieving is particularly important in the 21st century because it's one of the few socially acceptable forms of outward-facing mourning. Discussing the death of Queen Elizabeth II, for instance, is more socially permissible than talking about your sister who passed. One loss is far away, the other up close, real. Most people are generally receptive to the former. To borrow the Susan Sontag's phrase, it is a conversation between two people in the land of the healthy. The latter is a conversation between someone in the land of the sick who is trying to cross the border. It's no surprise that form of publicity grief is often used as PR strategy. Think of all the emails and social media posts in times of collective grieving. After the Boston Marathon bombing, the food site Epicurious tweeted, then deleted, "In honor of Boston and New England, may we suggest whole grain cranberry scones?" When the musician Prince died, Cheerios tweeted, "Rest in peace," on a purple background with a Cheerio dotting the I, also later deleted. Everyone at Domino's joins the nation and the world in mourning the death of QE2, read a tweet posted by Domino's UK in a dramatic black and white, still up as of this writing. The aim was to get you to buy Cheerios or order a pizza from a company you think of as socially engaged, as entities that have the capacity for an emotion as human as grief. It also, perhaps inadvertently, helps establish a hierarchy of what is worth grieving. What kind of loss merits a tweet from Domino's? Whose death will Cheerios memorialize? For what level of loss might I consider baking whole grain cranberry scones? Grief here is fundamentally an intense form of attention. Those in power have an incentive to use grief as a spotlight on events that bolster national identity, financial or brand interest, or otherwise, just as they have an incentive not to draw attention to events that could sow discord or upend these interests. What a society chooses to grieve is ultimately its way of, quote, posing the question of who we are, writes the philosopher Judith Butler, by asking whose lives are considered valuable, whose lives are mourned, and whose lives are considered ungrievable. I've long felt mixed up in how I might share my grief, which, with all the respect my mother deserves, isn't a grief necessarily of immediate public interest. It wasn't clear to me what grieving with others could even mean. How could I find community without troubling other people or feeling that I was making it all about me? The path of least resistance was to shut down, to not talk about it, to train myself to react to the inevitable, "Oh, I'm very sorry," with kinder and kinder letdowns to the point of replying, "No worries," in response to people consoling me. It's a bullshit dance we all do. Between the commonality of publicity grief and the cultural pursuit of happiness at all costs, few of us know how to really be there for someone grieving. And so what's easiest for the griever is to do nothing, to isolate herself. True community is rarely forthcoming. I failed to connect with almost everyone around me in my grief, but I don't blame others so much as I blame myself. I was the one who chose to tell everyone I was fine. It was worse to watch friends and teachers and faraway family struggle to say something useful. Sometimes they'd say the wrong thing, be too dismissive, too interested and overbearing. I didn't know what I wanted or needed out of others, and they didn't know what to say, a stalemate. The irony was that I thought after a loss, one would become the center of attention in one's community, for better or worse. In reality, you become more invisible. Like the memoirists I had been reading, I wanted a way to talk about my grief if I was going to connect with others about it. Right now, it was too amorphous. A narrative would help, I thought, a story to tell, to make it easier to understand, easier to empathize with, and find community.
I mean, yep. To what extent is there maybe policy in the works or some...
I laugh because there's not, but go on.
Okay, well, just a general... we saw sort of a bigger discussion in America during and in the years as we were coming out of the worst of the pandemic to address the shortcomings in our mental health system, in our ability to give people space to feel things. Do you sense in the conversations you've had while traveling in the U.S. that there's a desire for change to be enacted in a bigger way, for this to become something, given how universal it is, that we can't look at this as, taking the time to grieve is going to affect the bottom line, and so therefore we can't allow people to do that? Or is it that it just needs to be part of a bigger push to do better when it comes to mental and emotional health?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly hard, as you're identifying, but I do think, sort of as I was saying, there's been some push through with social media, with people trying to connect, and we're not there yet, but there's definitely, to my sense at least, a feeling of wanting that connection, of knowing that we should have that community, that we should find that community. But right now, at least in the US, it's very difficult to sort of break through the boundaries that are hemming us in right now.
And we're sitting in Paris, where you've studied and lived for chunks of time, but it's also where your mother found the lump that would lead to her diagnosis. How has that impacted your relationship with Paris? And do you feel that 10 years on, you go through and you navigate Paris without associating it to a certain memory?
That's such an interesting question, that sort of geography of grief to some degree. I mean, I think I would invert your question slightly in that, yes, it was the place where she found a lump near her left clavicle that would be identified as melanoma, but it was also the last place that I saw her fully healthy too. And so, Paris has always had, I don't know, it's the best. Why do I live in New York? I don't know. It's a spot that it holds a lot of value to me, and there's definitely places that we went and that we saw that just getting to be, a lot of the book is about me going to Wyoming, where she met my father, where she went to university. and sort of trying to really push up against her story and find meaning in that potent convergence. And I have a little bit of that here in Paris too.
So you're okay making new memories here?
Yeah, I think that's right.
We've had a lot of meals, so I hope those stick around in your mind. Before we get to questions from the audience, and I'm sure there are going to be plenty, what do you hope for people when they finish reading, the biggest takeaway? Because obviously for some people, they're still going to want a kind of miracle solution, whether or not it exists, or regardless of whether or not it exists. But what do you want, even the people who haven't yet gone through sort of life upending grief, knowing that it will come?
Yeah, I mean, I hope people would really read the book and give themselves space to reflect on this future that I'm sort of identifying that we're moving into, that's increasingly individualized, it's increasingly, I mean, we didn't even talk about prolonged grief disorder really, but increasingly based in diagnoses and diagnostics, and really question that and wonder the degree to which those things have value, and think through a little bit more of kind of zooming out and looking a little more historically at grief, but then also just talking about it and seeing that it is something that, I mean, I when I was doing bibliotherapy, I was writing about how Cicero was writing about his dead daughter Tulia thousands of years ago. Like, this isn't a new phenomenon by any means, and I'm very much neither the first nor the last to write about it or to think about it. So just being warmed to some degree by that understanding that it's so much more universal than I think people who are in grief tend to feel.
Thank you, Cody.
Thanks, everybody.
Do we have some questions in the audience? Yes. Well, I'll let her pass around the mic.
Well, thank you. Well, I've been through grief myself, but it's not about me. Well, professionally speaking, I've been involved with victims of terrorism. You know, we've had our share of terrorism here in Paris, especially 10 years ago, and their form of grieving is absolutely horrendous. One word comes to mind, it's conflict. These people seem to be in conflict for the rest of their lives. Either it's about the terrorists who killed the person, and then it may even be, well, against themselves. That is called the survivor syndrome. That means, why did I survive? Well, I should have died. Someone else should have survived. And it looks like these people are in conflict. I'd like to know, well, what conflict means to you in terms of grieving. Is it possible, according to you, to your research, to go beyond what Johann Galtung, you may know who he was, called negative peace, that is the mere absence of violence, that means just living with it? And is it possible to have some positive peace, that is rising again and, well, living, well, to the fullest, well, once more?
Yeah, wow, good question. I'm not versed specifically in grief of terrorism, and you would certainly know better than I would, but it really comes back to me to thinking about grief more holistically and thinking about the layers and the complexities of it, and thinking, so for instance, this woman who I mentioned earlier, Pauline Boss, she was writing in the late 1970s. I think she's like 91 now. She's spry as ever. But she was writing about soldiers who'd gone missing in action in Vietnam. And she was writing also about wives of husbands who were psychologically not present, in the sense that these often aren't viewed as forms of grief. And perhaps for something like survivor syndrome, it's hard for people to get their head around that. It's not a tangible grief. There's not, it's so rooted in their psychology, and there's not necessarily a body that they can point to and say, that is exactly what I'm grieving. And so I think having this sort of zoomed out approach and this wider understanding of the various legitimate kinds of grief is going to be hugely helpful. I don't know yet with terrorism specifically, but hopefully that sort of speaks to what you're asking. Yeah, thanks.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Erin. How's it going?
Hi, pretty well. Congratulations again. And my question was, during the research process, was there anything or things that you found most surprising? You sort of did this deep dive, I imagine, over months or maybe longer than that.
Many years, yeah.
Yeah, many years, in fact. Was there anything that changed your outlook of grief or the grieving process by the end of the research that was different from what it was going in?
It's a great question. I didn't realize how controversial grief is. There's enormous controversy in the medical field over prolonged grief disorder, which I mentioned. And so when that was added, the DSM-5 tax revision 2 years ago, it basically said that you had to, it was only a death loss, and it has to have been at least a year ago, and you have to be grieving in a way that meets 3 symptoms for 30 days in a row, more or less. Those symptoms are things like marked sense of or lost identity, sense of emotional numbness, things like that. And it got so much press and so much heat for this idea that there's you're grieving at a degree that meets a mental illness construct, basically. And I found myself, the book sort of opens with this, because I found myself, I understand to some degree the idea of wanting to place grief within a realm where there is research and there is money and people are wanting to make forward progress. But then it's also very scary to think about grief as something that is abnormal in that way. And especially when it doesn't separate kinds of grief, like terrorism grief is going to be something that's very different than other kinds of grief. So I was surprised at the very robust scholarly debate that's going on, and didn't really realize that. And I think just as a function of so many people having grieved, and so many people really swearing by the way that they did it, there's a sense of rightness or wrongness about how to that I don't necessarily love. I do think it is a really subjective experience and something that you really have to do kind of on your own. You don't necessarily have to subscribe. So yeah, I don't know. That's sort of like a weirder answer, but more meta scholarly, I found that to be low level shocking, I guess.
Hi, thank you. This is so interesting to hear because, as Lindsey knows, I love talking about grief, which is surprising because I lost my mom to ovarian cancer 8 years ago, and I was kind of surprised by my own experience. Some of it's I live here, and I've created the freedom to go home to the U.S. So if I was in a different system and hearing you there, so it's interesting. And also hearing all the different kinds of research because I realized grief was something nobody ever told me about, and I was like, ooh, this is not how it is in the movies and TV. So my question for you is, like, all this research is fascinating to me, but I'm really interested in the things that, like, aren't measurable, and I'm not sure if that's addressed in the book or how much what you learned from it.
That's like the whole second half of the book. So yeah.
But like you've kind of pointed to it during all your travels and at the bar, and I just feel like one of my dear friends lost her brother a year and a half ago, and I was like, she met all the people who had lost their brother in life. Or my neighbor who I used to babysit her kids back in Virginia, she's like, look for the signs. So yeah, curious about the like less tangible research.
Signs. That's a really interesting. Signs. See, is there a pattern, right? Like, do you end up? I think that's where you're going with it, right?
Curious about anything. Like, you can't. Those are the things that you can't measure. So yeah, in terms of the research of so much of the research, it's like we want the answers, we want the solution. But for me, these supports that I was surprised I found and was kind of grateful there. I wasn't like, oh, I'm supposed to follow 7 steps.
Oh my gosh, yeah. 7 steps, 5 steps. That was a huge moment for me when I realized the sort of like the just deeply untrue nature of the 5 stages of grief and how people don't grieve linearly like that, and you don't have to hit these things, and the sort of sad degree to which people view it as a blueprint. I was talking to one psychiatrist, and she said she had a client come in and told her, I'm trying to get my husband to get me angry so I can get through the anger stage faster. And it's like, no, you're doing it wrong. but is she doing wrong? But yeah, there's a real sense of the things we get wrong about grief. I think the intangibles for me were just those off the cuff conversations and that understanding of how just barely beneath the surface these things are bubbling for so many people, and how you can throw numbers at it, you can throw studies at it, but at the end of the day, just sitting and having a cup of tea with your neighbor, just sitting and calling someone up, does more than so much scholarship and so much medicine can really possibly do, I think.
One of the things that I think is very human, certainly in Western societies, is we accumulate a lot of stuff. And I'm wondering to what extent in sort of grief studies and in your own experience, the issue of what to do with a deceased person's things. And I'm not talking about the big stuff, I'm not talking about the furniture, the houses, or the property that can be sold, or, it's often the subject of family squabbles. But it's like the very intimate things like papers and letters and, the very small possessions, even toys or models or things like that nobody else is going to want, but somehow they remind you of somebody. And one of the reasons I raise this is because it seems to me that one of the things we often do is put these things in boxes and put them away, but then at some point we realize we need to somehow deal with it and process it. And I'm just wondering to what extent that is something that reawakens a grief or a sense of loss that perhaps you thought you'd gotten over.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And two things. One, it's going to be really interesting as sort of younger generations die and a lot of their things are digitized, or it's like, do you hand down a USB stick? Do you hand down your 1Password account? And there's all things on Facebook with memorializing and that sort of thing. But for me personally, in the last, it was her penultimate and anti-penultimate days of life, I did basically short interviews with my mother, where I asked her the things that I thought I would want to know. My brother, my dad, and I all sat around the dining room table. They asked a few questions too, and things like, what would you say to my brother and me on our wedding days? What would you, what do you want for us sort of going forward? And then also more trivial things. What's your favorite ice cream flavor? What's your favorite movie? And it took me, those were 52 minutes of audio files, I think, over the 2 days, split into maybe 4 or 5 files. And it took me probably 4 years to listen to those. And this sense of really, and I think there's a real similarity to opening those boxes and having that dust sort of come out and settle of, you're really facing their goneness. You're really facing that they're dead. And I think for me, with those interviews, and presumably for a lot of people with notebooks, anything like that. I mean, for me also, her gratefulness journal that she held toward the end of her life, looking at those things is extremely hard to do, but I think it's really valuable to do too. And there's a sense of not acceptance, but of finally getting to live alongside the death rather than trying to put it in the rearview mirror. Because I think closure in general is not a really helpful concept. I think this idea that grief ends is far less helpful than this idea that grief is in one hand and joy in life are in the other.
Congratulations on the book.
Thanks, Eric.
So you've been through this incredible journey, which is the journey of grief. And as you both mentioned, many people may have not noticed how intimate and how deep this was felt by you. And so you went through this journalistic, scholarly research, experimental, etc., which was very much an intimate and internal process. Maybe not many people didn't realize still then where you were at. And then boom, come June, all of a sudden it's out in the open. And for 2.5 months or 3, you've been out there talking to people. How do you feel maybe that has taken away some of that intimacy? And maybe also, does that have in itself an impact, like a last chapter of that journey throughout?
It's a great question. I mean, I did struggle to some degree with, is this something I want to publish? You can write something, but then to publish it is a wholly different decision. But one of the sort of core arguments, of course, is that we all should be more honest and be more open and be more vulnerable about in our grief. And I wanted to make sure that I was doing that too. I wanted to make sure that my story was something that I was being really honest about and being really open about. So yeah, it's interesting about the intimacy. There definitely are a few things that I just don't talk about. And when I do interviews or when I go do readings and things, I have sort of a brick wall away from those things. So there's a few things that I like to keep really just for me and my immediate family. But I really have endeavored to be as genuinely open about this kind of intimate process of memoir and sharing as I can be.
Hi, Cody. Thanks very much for the talk this evening. Having gone through quite a similar experience as you did, you mentioned something just a minute ago about you did almost a preparation to grieve by doing the recordings. And how much, or did you find in the research and talking to different people, doing a level of preparation? So in the case of a terminal illness diagnosis, you know you have X amount of time. Was there anything that was found to be more helpful after the passing that people can do to prepare when they face a situation like that versus, say, a shock grief, like someone's just died in a car accident? Was there anything they found that was help people prepare more when they actually know it's coming within a defined period of time?
It's such a good question. I mean, one of the things that I've found really helpful, I don't know, have you read Atul Gawande's Being Mortal? Yeah, and just this this idea of extending quality of life, even if that means quantity of life is reduced, can sometimes be the decision that's best for people. And I think a lot of that kind of thinking is similar to what you were talking about, where you're preparing and you're grieving for this end that's going to happen, but you're being very honest about it too. I think for us, our family was very blueprint oriented, we're going to go to this experimental trial, we're going to go to that experimental trial, we're going to get it fixed. And so even though it was about 4 years from when she was diagnosed to when she died, it felt like it could have been almost a car crash just because we were so convinced that she was going to be fine for so long. So I think I don't have a specific study to point to, but I would say that having that sort of awareness of the importance of quality of life is a really hard thing to face, but it's something that I think I somewhat regret about the way that we handled my mother's death. Was it your mom that died?
My father.
Your dad? Yeah. From melanoma. Nice. Light-skinned. It's rough. It's not even that, too. There's new research on that, but yeah, it is crazy. But thank you for the question.
Do we have time for a couple more? Okay.
Thank you for sharing your story. And I was wondering, when exploring your grief, how much did you find about being a man had an impact? Because I feel like for years, women were sort of even forced to grieve, even for a longer amount of time that they sometimes wanted, or cry, and men were not, or not as much. And how much does that impact your grieving today, and probably like male and female type of grieving?
Oh yeah, I mean, through all major religions that I can think of, through all kind of expectations of whether it's Victorian mourning or whatnot, it's women are always expected to grieve longer and in more more outfits. And I mean, a lot of that is obviously due to like socio-political reasons. But for me now in 2024, expectations, I don't think it's like it's extra hard as a man to write about your grief or to think about your grief, but I do think there might still be, it's hard to say, and I do think it is subjective, but there might still be a real sense of it's more okay for women to grieve outwardly than men. I'm not sure though. It's definitely something that's we really saw historically when there were more visual representations of grief, and now that those things have been stripped away, it becomes much more interpersonal, I think, and it becomes much more sort of quieter social expectations. I think it's probably still there, but I also wouldn't want to make any kind of broad prescriptive claim on that either. But it's a fascinating question. I've only been asked something similar to that like once before. It's the gendered nature of it is, you definitely see a lot more grief memoirs by women than by men. I mean, C.S. Lewis is the obviously big male exception, but basically every memoir that I read in preparation for writing this and that I read as a solace to my own grief was written by a woman.
Maybe one more question?
It's a bit niche, but
Which is good. That's good.
Okay, so but I have often had this debate at dinner parties because historically, you would read about famous women and you'd hear, oh, they lost like 6 out of 9 children before the age of 5, and I've thought about this, and everyone says, oh, like it wasn't a big deal back then, and I'm like, well, it feels to me that can't be true, but I can't point to an example or a memoir where you hear, I think, specifically women's voices about that. Can I give me something to tell them at dinner parties?
Sure. Off the top of my head, Abraham Lincoln threatened his wife, Mary Todd, with sending her to an insane asylum if she didn't stop crying so much about their dead son. The sense that it wasn't becoming of her to be grieving, it wasn't becoming of a woman of stature to grieve in such an outward way. That was recorded, I think, by her basically her assistant, or maybe, honestly, probably her slave. But that's an interesting one for men and women. I don't know. That is niche. I need to think on it more. But that seems cocktail party enough, maybe. Yeah. Okay. All right. Trivial Pursuit answer.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out and for celebrating Cody and his work.
Thank you, everyone, so much.